All right, now that we all know that concrete and cement are not the same thing, and we know that cement is just one ingredient in our concrete, let's take a look at the other ingredients, and I'll introduce a few more terms to our discussion. So in order to make good, strong concrete, I need to blend together what we call fine aggregates, otherwise known as sand, coarse aggregates, otherwise known as rocks, water, and our cement. Now, these products are combined in very specific proportions, according to a recipe that we'll call the mix design. This mix design is going to be produced by a concrete technician, someone that has a high level of training in how to proportion these ingredients, and they're going to make sure that they get the results that are needed. Now, these proportions and products will change, and that'll depend on the needs of the project. But the general proportions of each of these ingredients is about 40 to 45% coarse aggregates, about 25% sand, 16% water, and then about 11% of it is our cement. Now, if you're following along and you've added these numbers up, you're probably a little shy of 100%, and that's because the rest of the volume in the concrete is air. Some of that air is entrapped in the mix during that blending and mixing process, and some of it we're going to put there intentionally, but I'll talk about the air a little bit later. For now, let's go ahead and talk about what does happen when I mix all this stuff together. So when we first mix this together, the concrete is in what we call its plastic state. It flows. Those dry ingredients combine with the water, and they give us a nice workable product that we can place into forms that we set, and those forms are going to shape this plastic material into its final position and its final form. Now, I can build formwork that allows me to make concrete into things like columns, a slab, beams, walls, even countertops and roof tiles. And all of this is possible because when we first blend the ingredients together that make concrete, it's in this nice plastic state that we can work with. Now, that fresh concrete mix is only going to stay plastic for about 90 minutes. Then that plastic workable material is going to start to harden. The point at which this material first starts to harden, we're going to call that the initial set. Now, once that initial set starts, we need to be done moving it around. It needs to be in place because at this point, if we continue to disturb it and we move it around, we're going to damage it and we're going to end up with a final product that's cracked or has a lower than intended strength. Now, that's why you'll hear some people refer to concrete as a perishable product. You've only got so long to work with it. Once that initial set starts, we then start the finishing process. And this is where we give the surface its final look. Now, this look could be a smooth trowel finish, it could be a broom finish so people don't slip, or maybe even a complex surface made by stamping patterns into the concrete. Now, this finishing operation is performed by someone that we're going to call the concrete finisher, and this is someone that's trained and experienced in recognizing when that concrete is setting and when and how to get the finish that's needed without damaging the concrete. All right, at this point, the concrete's going into its second stage, its hardened state. This is its final state, and that's going to become our sidewalks, our columns, our walls, our floors. And one of the things that's really important about this transformation from its plastic state to its hardened state is you need to understand that the concrete is not getting hard because it's drying out. It's getting hard because it's undergoing a chemical process called hydration. In fact, letting it dry out's a bad thing because if the water leaves too soon or too rapidly, then I might not have enough water to continue and complete that hydration process. Remember, I used some terms earlier when we were talking about the history of concrete, and I mentioned that most cements are also known as hydraulic cements, and I said that means that they can harden underwater. Well, the reason they harden underwater is exactly this. It's not drying out. It's actually using up the water in the mix in a chemical process where the water and cement combine and they begin to form a new hardened compound. And this is the process that we call hydration. What's happening here is that each of the individual cement particles is combining with water and they're essentially growing little microscopic fingers. Now, when it's in its plastic state, the cement and water are what's known as paste. And it's this paste that hardens as the water gets used up in the chemical reaction. The cement particles grow those fingers, and those fingers begin to interlock. Now, they're interlocking with each other. They interlock with the fine and the coarse aggregates. And as long as the water remains in the mix, this process can continue. Those fingers can continue to grow. So it's really important that we don't let the water bleed out the top and evaporate, even after the final finishing operations are done. And this is really critical in something with a large surface area like a big concrete floor. So this is a process that we call curing, this process of keeping the moisture in the concrete. And it starts immediately after the finishers get the surface finishing done. Now, there are different ways of curing the concrete depending on the site conditions. We can cover the concrete with a sheet of plastic to seal in the moisture, or we can spray on a chemical that essentially does the same thing. Or in some cases, the finishers may cure the concrete by actually applying a fog or a light spray of water. Now, I'm going to make sure that this curing continues as long as possible until the concrete hardens to its desired strength and durability. Ideally, this would be 5 to 7 days. So once you understand what's happening here, what's happening when the concrete's getting hard, some of the things I said earlier hopefully begin to make sense. Remember, when that initial set begins, I said we can't touch it. Those fingers are starting to grow and interlock, so I don't want to disturb the concrete and break those things up. As hydration continues and that final set occurs, the concrete is completing that transition from plastic to a hardened state, and the water's being used up in this chemical reaction. So again, we want to keep that moisture in the concrete using the curing process. Now, this is the process by which concrete's been made for hundreds of years. But as our knowledge about this chemical process has increased, we have made a few advances beyond what those ancient Romans had available to them. So now that we've gone through and you hopefully understand this basic process, let's go ahead and look at some things that we can do when we apply a little chemistry to the mix.